Vladimir Putin is running out of friends. After 18 months in command of Russia's ongoing invasion of the sovereign nation of Ukraine, a man who was once regarded as a rather shrewd, albeit brash, strong man, has been revealed for what he truly is: a sinister, ruthlessly authoritarian dictator willing to waste tens of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian lives alike in exchange for a burned-out village here or a patch of grass there. After adopting nigh-on genocidal tactics like the forced adoption of Ukrainian children into the heart of Russia, after attempting to leverage Europe's energy crisis into a forced capitulation, and after tacitly endorsing, or perhaps even ordering, the widespread use of torture against Ukrainian civilians, while much of the world is in lockstep about precisely what a dangerous figure Vladimir Putin really is. The United States, the European Union, other Western nations are standing firmly against him. China seems to view him as a tool in order to bring a future Russia under a larger global hegemony. His many client states around the world have been forced to increasingly hold him at arm's length, powerless to stop his worst impulses, but powerless to wean themselves off economic and energy dependence on his economy. But ask North Korea, and Vladimir Putin appears to be looking like more and more of an ally. From a budding military partnership to clear political and diplomatic overtures, North Korea has been looking to ask Vladimir Putin out to the school dance for some time now. And with few other options, Putin appears more and more willing to say, yes, sure, let's dance. Make no mistake, this is not a partnership based on love like any good political marriage. It is one of mutual benefit and a shared hunger for power that simply cannot be satisfied alone. But with Russia's list of friends growing shorter by the day, the names that do remain on that list become all the more important, and there is one name in particular that we're going to be discussing today. Now, the Russian capital city of Moscow and the North Korean capital of Pyongyang are separated by some 6,400 kilometers as the crow flies. That is nearly 1,000 kilometers further apart than London is from New York, further than a flight from Berlin to Mumbai, and further than the city of Caracas is from San Francisco. But believe it or not, Russia and North Korea are technically neighbors, sharing either side of a land border that runs just 17.3 kilometers long. The two countries have been linked by the so-called Friendship Bridge since 1959, and North Korea enjoyed a long and very cozy relationship with the modern Russian state's predecessor, the Soviet Union. In fact, it was the Soviets who were the first to recognize North Korea as an independent nation in 1948, and North Korea's status as a communist nation, heavily influenced by Stalinism, made it a key partner of the Soviets before, during, and after the Korean War. But despite the historical closeness between the Soviet Union and North Korea, modern-day Russia has been a good bit more hesitant to really lean into any level of friendship. Put simply, a close alliance with North Korea is a liability for any nation that flirts with Pyongyang overtly enough to be noticed. Between North Korea's nuclear program and the resulting economic blockade of the country and its horrific treatment of its own people, North Korea is essentially a pariah state, a global outcast, and one that most of the world's nations will just happily reject in unison. No, thank you. The modern Russian Federation, especially under long-time President Vladimir Putin, has generally worked hard to be perceived as a level-headed, legitimate player in global affairs. They appear to have a relationship with North Korea that goes beyond what the world can accept as being necessary in light of the shared history of the two neighbor nations, and Russia has long risked ostracization or even being lumped into pariah status alongside North Korea. Explain all that to Vladimir Putin of today, though, and you probably won't make much of an impact, because ever since the mid-2010s, Putin's Russia has appeared to move toward a sort of endgame. Previous offences, like violence in Chechnya and other Russian minority enclaves, and a brief brutal war in the sovereign nation of Georgia, have been begrudgingly accepted by the rest of the world, certainly not as an ideal outcome, but as something everybody's willing to stomach in order to not make greater problems. But when that same cycle began repeating in the nation of Ukraine, something seemed to change. First with an annexation of Ukrainian-held Crimea, then by propping up a years-long low-grade insurgency in Ukraine's Donbas region, and finally with the full-scale invasion that began in 2022, Russia has been pushing the envelope further and further, and although Russian leaders certainly haven't been happy about it, they've ultimately proven willing to suffer through the sanctions and loss of face that have come with such choices. And at this point, Russia too has become something of a pariah state, isolated from large parts of the Western world in response to its acts of overt aggression toward a smaller neighbor. But Russia's situation isn't quite so simple, because while the United States, the European Union, and much of the global West have rejected Putin's expansionism out of hand, a number of other nations have been less willing to say goodbye to often fruitful diplomatic and economic ties with the world's largest nation. China has continued to provide Russia with mostly non-lethal support in its war effort, and China's Xi Jinping has made no bones about his willingness to form a more directly collaborative relationship with Russia in the future. So too, do major regional powerhouses like Brazil, India, and South Africa share ties with Russia under the BRICS affiliation, a group that Saudi Arabia, Iran, Argentina, and other nations agreed to join as recently as August of 2023, and a year and a half into a horrific war waged by one of BRICS's major players. Russia maintains major ties with NATO member Turkey, and it's got massive influence in the wealthy Gulf states, as well as a number of developing nations around the world. So, in a diplomatic sense, things are not looking great for Russia, but they aren't looking awful. China, India, and Brazil are all wealthier nations than Russia is, and Iran and Saudi Arabia aren't far behind, suggesting that there could be quite a bit of benefit to Russia and its people if they can do the hard work of strengthening those ties. But much like walking into a dinner party holding a literal pile of feces probably isn't going to make you popular, so too do increasingly visible ties between Russia and North Korea risk alienating just about everyone else who hasn't already turned on Putin. Compared to Russia, North Korea's list of allies is real short. China is the nation's main economic benefactor, to the point that it basically props up North Korea on its own 2 feet, but even that relationship has been badly strained in recent years. India has stepped up its economic ties with the Hermit Kingdom, but not to nearly the level that we'd call friendly. Brazil is generally regarded as an opponent of the North Korean regime. Turkey barely speaks to them, and even Russia's neighbor Belarus, widely considered little more than an extension of Putin-controlled Russia, has only the bare minimum informal relations. Even among nations who actively shy away from Europe and North America, North Korea remains the skunk at the garden party. On paper, at least, one would think that Russia would be unwilling to risk the trade-offs that would come from shaking North Korea's proverbial hand. So what does North Korea have that's so special, and why is Russia so eager to get it right now? Well, when we look at which overtures Russia has decided to make toward North Korea, and just as conspicuously the dimensions of diplomacy that they've chosen to leave out, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what Russia is after. The answer is war supplies, specifically artillery shells, ammunition, and the other forms of lethal aid that China and other Russian partners have been unwilling to provide. Since much of North Korea's inventory is Soviet-era weaponry, with which modern Russian forces share a good deal of interoperability if they dig through some dusty weapons depots, they could be a relief valve for a Russian military-industrial complex that is straining to keep up with demand. According to US intelligence, North Korean weaponry has already made its way into Russia in decent quantities, although the partnership Putin and Kim may be considering would be a bit more substantial than that. Now, it's not as if Vladimir Putin needs to lie sleepless at night wondering whether North Korea will be willing to come to the table. The Hermit Kingdom is desperately in need of any sort of economic relief, no matter where it comes from, and the ruling regime, opulent as ever, is more than happy to skim off the top of any trade deals or arms shipments that may result from a partnership. North Korea has repeatedly signaled that it takes no issue with how Russia has conducted itself in Ukraine. In 2022, North Korea joined only Russia and Syria in recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, 2 breakaway states in eastern Ukraine that are essentially Russian puppet states. So too did they vote against a UN resolution to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, joined only by Belarus, Syria, Eritrea, and of course Russia. Now, as we've already explained, they've most likely been contributing munitions to Russia for some time now, and North Korea has offered Russia tens of thousands of manual laborers to assist with infrastructure projects. And if North Korea were to receive the sorts of money that would come from a major arms sale, then they'd be able to funnel that money into their intercontinental ballistic missile program, which, at least in theory, is meant to deter aggression protection from the West and South Korea so that a war involving conventional munitions would never take place. In service to the potential arms deal, Vladimir Putin is, at the time of writing, believed to be entertaining the possibility of a face-to-face meeting with Kim Jong-un in the next few weeks. This meeting would likely take place in the Russian city of Vladivostok, building on existing relationships between the North Koreans and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Putin and Kim have met in the past. They did their first awkward world leader handshake in 2019, but this time it would be to coordinate not just an arms deal, but other grand signs of increasing cooperation, like a series of rumored joint naval exercises between Russia, North Korea, and their mutual neighbor China. Shoigu and other top Russian officials have made visits to Pyongyang as recently as July 2023, and Putin and Kim are believed to have begun personally exchanging letters, laying the groundwork for a series of agreements that could conceivably happen fast once the wheels are set in motion on both sides. As for what the Russian military actually needs, it's likely that arms transfers would come with preference to anti-tank rockets, artillery shells, and ammunition for small arms. Anti-tank rockets from prior generations work reasonably well even on the most advanced tanks of today, while the older Soviet-era equipment that Russia's been forced to rely on for its artillery needs is the same equipment that North Korea has been reproducing at a large scale for decades. The country's rifles, tanks, armored mercenary carriers, and warplanes are mostly obsolete, and those that would be useful in a 21st century full-scale war are going to take a lot more convincing to get from North Korea's inventory than some artillery shells. It's that ammunition that's really critical in a war that's turned into more and more of a meat grinder every day. If it can be moved, it'll likely be via rail links along that narrow strip of shared border that we mentioned. Although, if either Putin or Kim can move heaven and earth to get China to cooperate, there's the outside possibility that a much larger amount of munitions could be transported across Eurasia in a relatively short span of time. Now, the thing that we've got to make really clear in all of this is just how badly Russia seems to need those weapon shipments. It's a good general rule to assume that if Vladimir Putin himself is acknowledging publicly that something is wrong in Russia, then something is really, really wrong, and the rule becomes especially relevant when we acknowledge that Putin's been publicly discussing Russia's arms shortages all through the summer of 2023. According to the man himself, Russia is running out of high-precision ammunition, communications equipment, aircraft, drones, and so on. And while North Korea doesn't have all of those assets ready to ship, they've got the sort of basic weaponry that can really make a difference. Just to give some perspective, estimates prior to the start of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, made during a time when Russia was supposed to be conserving its ammunition, estimated that the nation's military was still burning through some 10 to 15,000 artillery shells per day, in addition to missiles and suicide drones. That fire rate, plus a much higher rate in more intense moments in the conflict, has slowly been eating down a stockpile of an estimated 525,000 artillery shells in Ukraine, according to Ukrainian numbers that we've got to take with a grain of salt, of course. Russia is believed to have far more, about 16 million rounds, with an unknown number of duds, but even assuming no duds and that conservative rate of fire, that would put Russia depleting its forward artillery stockpiles every 52 days and running out of artillery completely after 1,600 back-to-back relatively low-key days of fighting in Ukraine. Push that number to an average day of conflict, call it 25,000 shells per day, and factor in, say, every other shell being inoperable, based on reports that about half of the ones in storage are visibly rusty and in poor condition. Under those circumstances, Russia runs out of shells in just under a year, and that's before we account for Ukrainian strikes on Russian ammo dumps. Of course, we've got to factor in the rate at which Russia produces new artillery shells, but that rate is roughly 700 rounds per day across all of Russia. As Forbes explains, that's enough to take one battery of 652mm guns and fire them for a 15-minute bombardment in order to leave exactly 0 shells behind for the entire rest of the Russian offensive. With that dire of a situation for Russia, its status as the wealthier, better-armed nation may not matter much in practice. Russia can have all of the food, critical equipment, and luxury goods in the world, but if North Korea doesn't need those trade items as badly as Russia needs weapons, then it's Kim Jong-un who's in the driver's seat here. Arms that might not have been worth much 5 years ago might suddenly get very expensive when they're offered up. After all, North Korea knows all too well that Russia, like everyone else in the world, wouldn't be coming to the negotiating table if they had any more palatable option. And if Russia's position on the world stage does improve, they'll probably leave North Korea behind. Better to take advantage of a desperate Russia when it's presented on a silver platter, knowing that Russia is more likely to keep coming back if these deals with North Korea further isolate them from everybody else. In any normal diplomatic exchange, Russia should have all of the leverage in the world over North Korea, but the reality of this situation could turn their bilateral order on its head, and fast. And all of this is bad enough for Russia on its own, but there's also something to be said for simple imagery on the world stage. Kim Jong-un has vowed to hold hands with Vladimir Putin in his invasion of Ukraine since it began, but so far he's been waiting with arms outstretched and made to hope that Putin might eventually come his way. Now that Putin's showing interest, it's not much of a leap to paint a picture of Russia's mad dictator running into North Korea's embrace like a toxic ex-lover. Sergei Shoigu has already become the first Russian defense minister to make a visit to North Korea since the Soviet Union dissolved, and this amount of personal attention paid to Kim and his regime is atypical even for Vladimir Putin, let alone for your average world leader. Of course, this isn't to say that North Korea doesn't also get some serious benefit out of the deal. In addition to the cold hard cash they'd receive in return for their munitions, North Korea would nestle up against a second powerful benefactor, reducing its dependency on China and thus making it less beholden to the will of Beijing. Not only that, but it would align North Korea with another major nuclear arms nation at the same time as the United States is seeking to enshrine trilateral pacts with nearby Japan and neighboring South Korea, thus chopping up the Far East along lines of regional alliances that could remain baked in for decades to come. And finally, there's the possibility, however unlikely, that the North Korean regime could actually use the money they make to, say, feed their people, or provide some level of medical support for the millions of North Koreans who've spent their entire lives in a state of malnourishment. In fact, Russia could conceivably meet all or part of North Koreans' price demands via food shipments, rather than simply fulfilling an international Venmo request, thus reining in the degree of latitude Russia affords North Korea by agreeing to participate in a bilateral deal in the first place. But as for who's getting the better end of the deal, the answer is obvious, and the answer is North Korea. Ultimately, any arms deal with Kim Jong-un would be an act of desperation from Russia and its Ministry of Defense, an acknowledgement that a combination of Western sanctions and Russian military-industrial unpreparedness have meant that Russia's bitten off more than it can chew in Ukraine. It would also, quite clearly, mean that Putin's Russia has begun to compromise what dignity and global influence it had left, choosing to throw in with states like North Korea, rather than face the music, concede that its invasion of Ukraine had been misguided, and work to re-establish connections with the global nations that could provide Russia with something more than simple explosives. And lastly, a long-running trade agreement with North Korea will almost certainly alienate countries like Brazil, India, and Turkey, who've been able to walk a tightrope and tacitly accept Russia's plausible deniability on some things, but would be unable to do the same if it meant implicitly legitimizing North Korea. If this sort of deal does go through, it's undoubtedly North Korea whose stock will rise, even if it's rising just a few inches from its incredibly dismal place on the world stage. And it's Russia whose stock will almost certainly take a massive hit, perhaps even one that cannot be reversed. Now, the prospect of major military cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang points to a wide range of implications for Russia, for North Korea, for Ukraine, and for the broader world order. The Russian war effort really is going that poorly, with Russia unable to come up with the kinds of munitions it believes it needs in order to decisively end the war in Ukraine. North Korea has an opportunity to become a relevant global player on some level, something it hasn't been in a very long time. Ukraine's stalwart defense is working, and as its counteroffensive continues to eat into Russian resources with shiny new tanks and fighter jets on the horizon, it's becoming more and more feasible that Russia might eventually be forced to capitulate. But there's also a much broader question. What happens if one of the world's two most heavily nuclear-armed nations loses its veneer of credibility before the international community and really goes off on its own to become a pariah state? What does it look like if Russia decides to simply be out for itself, not just in wars of expansion, but in all things? Who can a nation like that consider its friends, and how does a nation reckoning with its new pariah status, but well accustomed to being a major global player, learn to either accept that things have changed or force their way into the worldwide conversation as a perversion of the nation that once was? Russia has taken pains to nurture its cabal of rogue states for some time now. North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Nicaragua, Syria, Eritrea, and a few other nations are still all under Russia's political thrall to some degree or another, making their support clear in global diplomatic exchanges whenever it comes time for everyone else to condemn whatever awful thing Russia did that day. But, generally speaking, those nations have been a convenient set of partners when the moment is right, and they've typically not demanded too much attention otherwise from the Putin regime. Now with those nations coming to understand that Russia might need them as much as they need Russia, more and more of them may be hiking prices for the support that they do provide, enriching themselves while doing their own small part to knock Russia down a peg. And then there's the potential for Russia to begin forming dependencies in areas beyond just munitions supply, diplomatically and perhaps even economically. In the last few months, rumors of attempts to deepen ties between Russia and China have opened questions about just what the power imbalance in such a relationship might be, and specifically whether Russia and its ailing economy might be propped up by a benevolent China rather than both nations sitting as equal players in the Eastern Hemisphere. Given the choice between leaning on Beijing's imperfect but relatively decent reputation worldwide or relying on their own as they're understood in 2023, it makes good sense that Russia would choose the former. Specifics aside, it's impossible to ignore the massive implications that come from a Russian decision to extend a hand to North Korea and ask genuinely for help. Right now, we simply can't know what the long-term ramifications of such an agreement would be, but we've got a reasonable guess. And all things considered, that best guess doesn't look good for Russia. That's the deal when cozying up to North Korea. Sign on the dotted line, and for a little while, the immediate situation may improve. But what you pay in this devil's deal is to accept the idea of a future in which North Korea could well be your only friend. It's an outcome Putin and his highest officials are no doubt eager to avoid, so it must be difficult to acknowledge that right now, they're barreling straight toward it.